everybody. It's Kennon, and I'm here at the kitchen at Broadmoor's campus, and I'm here with somebody very special. In fact, it's Chef Steven Martinez. Chef Steven Martinez is our newest member. We're very excited about him. He comes to us from Portobello's restaurant in Denham Springs, and he's agreed to come on and be our food ministries director. Welcome aboard, Chef.
Well, great to be here, Pastor. I grew up in the Baton Rouge area. Food has been around all my life, as far back as I can remember. I remember my grandmother cooking. She's been a big inspiration to me. Helping her out, moved on with my mom, helping her out, and food's always been a passion to me. It's always been around in my life, and it's just something I enjoy and love to do. I've recently been engaged. I have 3 kids, 3 wonderful children. I love my family. I love what I do, and I love being a part of this church, this congregation, and be able to use the God-given talent that has been given to me in order to serve my community. I'm looking forward to meeting all of you and being a part of this family.
Good evening. I'm Pastor Kennon, and welcome to Bible study. We've been going through the book of Acts, and we've been asking a really important question. What's next? I've been asking that a lot this week as we started to consider how it would look as we began to gather again for worship. We're going to be doing that here at Broadmoor beginning June the 14th. And we'll do that in a registered format. So it'll be kind of like going to the movies where you find your seats and you pick them, and then that worship will be capped off to meet the CDC requirements on our building. But while we're asking ourselves what next, we're looking at the early church because that was the very same question that they were dealing with. And we've been talking about Paul a lot. Last week we were journeying with him on the tail end of his 3rd mission journey. And he's back in Jerusalem where we're picking up today. I'm going to be reading out of chapter 23 today. I'm going to pick up the last verse of 22 just to help orient us. And we're going to see that Paul has been on these missionary journeys, and as the good news of the gospel spreads throughout the land, the Sadducees and the Pharisees began to start hatching a plot to kill Paul because he's created a real threat to their power. And so we're going to pick up in Acts 22, verse 30, and then on into chapter 23. I'll be reading from the Message version. The next day determined to get to the root of the trouble and know for sure what was behind the Jewish accusation. The captain released Paul and ordered a meeting of the high priests and the high council to see what they could make of it. Paul was led in and took his place before them. Now, Paul has been detained in Jerusalem, and his captors are about to kill him there. Because Paul was born a Roman, though, and Tarsus was a free city, the commander became afraid when he was made aware of Paul's Roman citizenship, because in torturing him and threatening him as a foreigner, they had actually broken a law, and they had done it without any kind of trial in a foreign land. That was a problem. So to get some clarity and to backpedal a little bit, the Roman commander orders the whole council to meet and takes Paul before them, not as a prisoner, but actually as an equal. Listen to what happens next. Verse 1 in chapter 23. Paul surveyed the members of the council with a steady gaze, and then said his piece. Friends, I've lived with a clear conscience before God all my life up to this very moment. Now that set off the chief priest Ananias. He ordered his aides to slap Paul in the face. Paul shot back. God will slap you down. What a fake you are. You sit there and judge me by the law and then break the law by ordering me slapped around. Now this is not the Ananias that we talked about earlier in the book of Acts. We covered that several weeks ago. Rather, this is an appointee of Herod's to the office of chief priest. Now, Paul calls Ananias a hypocrite for accusing Paul of breaking the law and then ordering his aides to strike him. It was, in fact, illegal to strike a Roman citizen. And, as I said, Paul was from Tarsus. Picking up in verse 4, the aides were scandalized. How dare you talk to God's chief priest like that? Paul acted surprised. How was I to know he was chief priest? He doesn't act like a chief priest. You're right. The scripture does say, don't speak abusively to a ruler of the people. Sorry. Now the priest would not have been in his robes here. He wasn't doing work in the temple. So Paul would not have known by how he looked or by the way he was acting that he was any priest at all. Verse 6. Paul, knowing some of the council was made up of Sadducees and others of Pharisees, and how they hated each other, decided to exploit their antagonism. Friends, I am a stalwart Pharisee from a long line of Pharisees. It's because of my Pharisee convictions, the hope and resurrection of the dead, that I've been hauled into this court. I want you to see here how cunning Paul is. He knew that evoking himself as a Pharisee here would gain half of the room on his side and then pit it against the other half of the room. This dude is brilliant. Verse 7. The moment he said this, the council split down the middle, Pharisees and Sadducees going at each other in a heated argument. Sadducees have nothing to do with a resurrection or angels or even a spirit. If they can't see it, they don't believe it. Pharisees believe it all. And so a huge and noisy quarrel broke out. Then some of the religious scholars on the Pharisee side shouted down the others, "We don't find anything wrong with this man. And what if a spirit has spoken to him? Or maybe an angel? What if it turns out we're fighting against God?" That was fuel on the fire. The quarrel flamed up and became so violent, the captain was afraid they would tear Paul apart, limb from limb. He ordered the soldiers to get him out of there and escort him back to the safety of the barracks. Wow, now the Pharisees and Sadducees, they had argued this same matter for years and years. This was one of the pivotal problems that they had with each other. And so there was absolutely no way anybody was going to win this agreement. So what the Pharisees did by removing Paul and taking him away saved him his life, because they took him to the castle of Antonia, and that is a fort. So Paul gets saved by the Pharisees. Verse 11, the night the master appeared to Paul, the master appeared to Paul, it's going to be all right. Everything is going to turn out for the best. You've been a good witness for me here in Jerusalem. Now you're going to be my witness in Rome. I just want you to notice God's continuing care here. And you know what? Paul needs it in this moment. After all, he was a prisoner. Even the church in Jerusalem, which he had just brought the offering to, suspected him. His own race wanted to kill him. And twice in as many days, he had very narrowly escaped death. And as if all of that weren't bad enough, now he was going to Rome. So God cared for Paul enough to just say, it's going to be okay. Next day, the Jews worked up a plot against Paul. They took a solemn oath that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed him. Over 40 of them ritually bound themselves to this murder pact and presented themselves to the high priest and religious leaders. We've bound ourselves by a solemn oath to eat nothing until we have killed Paul, but we need your help. Send a request from the council to the captain to bring Paul back to you so that you can investigate the charges in more detail. We'll do the rest. Before he gets anywhere near you, we will have killed him. You won't be involved. Now, you know, I've always said, you don't have to look in a novel for an exciting story when you've got the Bible. I mean, this story about this plot to kill Paul is starting to sound a whole lot like the story of the plot to kill Jesus. Religious leaders breaking the law and being complicit with the framing and murdering of an innocent man. Verse 16. Paul's nephew, his sister's son, overheard them plotting the ambush. He went immediately to the barracks and told Paul. Paul called over one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the captain. He has something important to tell him." The centurion brought him to the captain and said, "The prisoner, Paul, asked me to bring this young man to you. He said he has something urgent to tell you." The captain took him by the arm and led him aside privately. "What is it? What do you have to tell me?" Paul's nephew said, "The Jews have worked up a plot against Paul. They're going to ask you to bring Paul to the council first thing in the morning on the pretext that they want to investigate the charges against him in more detail. But it's a trick to get him out of your safekeeping so they can murder him. Right now, there are more than 40 men lying in ambush for him. They've all taken a vow to neither eat nor drink until they have killed him. The ambush is set. All they're waiting for is for you to send him over." The captain dismissed the nephew with a warning. "Don't breathe a word of this to a soul." This is the word of God for the people of God. Now, this is kind of a crazy story. What on earth could we get from this murderous plot that might help the church when it's asking what's next? The first thing that stands out to me in this story is that these Jews, regardless of their religious beliefs and the laws that they subscribe to, and despite the fact that Paul himself was Jewish, lawlessly exploited Paul and tried to kill him. And they did this all because they perceived Paul as threatening their authority and their power. And because he believed differently about the Messiah. And so this exposed systemic corruption across their societal and cultural spectrums of that time. Just look at the setting, if you will. Jerusalem was an occupied territory, being oppressed by a foreign ruler. The rights of the native citizens have been completely violated. Look at the social structures. The government traded judicial support of the powerful religious leaders for guaranteed help and cooperation, expecting them to be complicit with their taxation and extortion of the people, many of whom they had enslaved. This created oppression, and it increased the dependency that the people had for their spiritual leaders. Do you see here the broken cycle, the systemic sin? Now look at their cultural structures. The Jewish leaders had held the heads of their followers underwater and commanded strict obedience to the laws that they themselves violated. To say the least, there were a lot of systemic inequities that were crushing the most marginalized and vulnerable of the citizens. They were slaves to these systems and their own fears of depravity under these corrupt leaders. And so think about how this plays out in our world today. Because systemic oppression, it is still very much alive and well in 2020. In the United States, we often celebrate the might of our alliances with foreign European countries, for instance. But ask any Native American about how they feel about having their land occupied by foreign rulers, and it may change your perspective. The only problem is, for many generations now, Native Americans have been quieted and downgraded to under-resourced, poverty-stricken reservations. Think about how our generalized political system, in which conservative evangelical Christians are often accused of being complicit with the GOP, while more liberal Christians are labeled and aligned with radical progressive socialists. I cannot tell you how much ministry I have facilitated over the years based on the relationship problems stemming from political and religious systemic chaos. But I can tell you this. It's a bunch. Think about how our own religious systems, remember how just a few months ago the denomination was in a big uproar over human sexuality? But isn't it amazing how quick the world became about self-preservation rather than these supercharged, hair-splitting religious beliefs? Systemic inequities are still crushing and hurting and even killing people. Even though Paul was protected by law, the religious leaders continued to plot his death and take the law into their own hands, irrespective that doing so made them the lawbreakers. And our world continues to allow women to do the same job as men and earn less pay. How is that legal in a free country? I want to talk to you about an event that I had here last summer called Renew. It was a revival event. We had two speakers, a man and a woman. The man commanded his price to come in and speak, and he did a phenomenal job. And the woman, when I asked about her fee, didn't really know what to say. She was willing to take what we would give. And I said, hey, how about I pay you the same as the male speaker that's coming in? And she was actually shocked at the equal treatment and the fairness of that arrangement. It will be something that she'll always remember about our church. So, I just want to say this. Our world continues to inflict harm and death upon the poor, upon the sick, upon the imprisoned, upon the widow, refugees, people of color, the LGBTQ community, and many others. And despite their protected rights as people who are created equal and who are of sacred worth, we do bodily harm, pressing our knee on the necks of the already oppressed as they cry out, I can't breathe. These are unacceptable acts of hate and a modern-day lynching of the vulnerable that simply cannot be allowed to continue. To do nothing as Christians with that is to be complicit. To support injustice against the vulnerable and the marginalized on the one hand, and then to go and tell people to love God and others on the other hand, is hypocrisy at the highest level and undeniably bears no fruit of the Spirit of God. It is, in fact, godless. Paul, knowing his rights, resourcefully beat them at their own game and called them out for their hypocrisy. And they wanted him dead for it. And that's exactly what we must do to fight for the injustices being brought upon the most vulnerable citizens in our community. We must, church, be like Paul, resourceful and cunning, knowing how to navigate and expose corrupt systems for what they truly are. It is a ministry must. You know what I loved about Paul in this story is that he took a page out of the Jesus playbook. At the very beginning of his ministry, Jesus stood up in the synagogue, unrolled the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and in a radically shocking construal, proclaimed himself as the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophetic words. I'm going to share them with you now. God's Spirit is on me. He's chosen me to preach the message of good news to the poor, sent me to announce pardon to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the burdened and battered free, and to announce this is God's year to act. What's next? Well, for starters, what if we are the church that does this for the very most vulnerable citizens in our community? What if we take a page out of Jesus's and Paul's playbook, a page right out of Acts, when we're faced with the opportunity? What if we demand equality for all, justice for all, mercy for all? What if we stop asking for mercy only for ourselves and the people who think like us? What if we stop seeking justice only for others and the people who are different from us? What if we take those who are being harmed by the sin of systemic corruption in our world and instead help them move towards Christ? What if we stop doing nothing, which is to be complicit, and do something? How much more good will our church do in transforming this community for Christ? What if we stood in our churches together and said boldly, God's Spirit is on us. He's chosen us to proclaim via Facebook Live, via YouTube, via Instagram, via live worship, the radical message of good news to the poor. One way that we put our service where our mouth is serving at Red Stick Together, or Southeast Ministries, or Habitat for Humanity, or Women Making a Difference in UMW, or even the Men of Broadmoor. God has sent us to announce pardon to prisoners, the ones both in a physical jail and those trapped in systems of inequality designed to hold people's heads underwater. God has sent us to announce recovery of sight to the blind and to the lost and to the eyes of the leaders of our community for the needs of our citizens. God has sent us to set the burdened and battered free, to take the oppressive knee off the necks of people of color and of women and of the LGBTQ community, maybe even refugees. This is God's year to act. What if we say, we are going to go and meet those people where they are, and we are going to simply help them take their next steps towards Jesus Christ. Will you pray with me? Holy God, thank you for this word from Acts. Thank you for this example that Paul has given us. Thank you that Paul has aligned himself closely with the ministry and actions of Jesus Christ. God, now pour out your Spirit upon us and give us agreement with Paul and Jesus here, that we will be spent proclaiming the good news to the most vulnerable in our community. God, use us. Use our church. Use our resources, our buildings, all of the ministry and giftedness that you've gathered here from all over, the talents of the people. God, the creativity, the instruments. Lord, help us to be transformative in this community now and always. In the name of your Son, Christ. Amen. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you'll join me again this time next week. Good night.
There are many ways that you can give toward the mission of Broadmoor. You can go to broadmoormethodist.org/giving to give safely and securely online. You can text Be More to 73256. And of course, you can also mail checks to our physical address at 10230 Mollylea Drive, Baton Rouge, Louisiana 70815.